Hello, welcome back to Books and Beer review ramblings of books. So today we're going to talk about a novel that I have been thinking about reading for a very long time, and we'll get into that a bit. But recently decided just to go for it and actually loved quite a bit. And so I don't obviously you clicked on this. This is about The Sorrows of Young Werther by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, or Goethe is what it looks like. My copy was translated by Stanley Korngold. And so, just to kind of summarize, most of The Sorrow of Young Werther is a story presented as a collection of letters written by the character Werther, who's a young artist who's very sensitive and passionate, and these letters are written to his friend Wilhelm. And that's most of the book. There are some times where it deviates from that structure, but for the most part, it's an epistolatory novel. And these letters are sent to his friend Wilhelm. Generally speaking, I don't really like epistolatory novels. They're not really my thing. I've read a few, and they're more common of this time period. But I really enjoyed this one, and I think I should give them more of a chance. I think maybe just the first one I was introduced to I didn't love. But I've read a few since then that I've actually enjoyed quite a bit. But basically, that is to say, the general summary of Sorrows of Young Werther is that while you're reading these letters, you basically get an account of Werther's time staying in this fictional village of Walheim, whose peasants and kind of simple folk have enchanted him with their simple ways. And he meets this girl, Charlotta, who's beautiful. She loves her siblings. She's basically like the surrogate mother for her family because their mother has died. And as he spends time with this group of people, this family, Werther falls desperately in love with Charlotta, despite knowing beforehand that she's engaged to a man named Albert, who's a little bit older than her. Okay, and so that's kind of the whole story of this book. This book is a famous story of unrequited love and sort of like the extremes that can drive a person to. And so despite knowing that she's engaged and how, that's a bummer if you're in love with a girl, you find out she's engaged, Werther spends the next months kind of cultivating this friendship with her and the rest of her family, until he basically gets to the point where he feels like he has to leave Walheim, and he goes to a more bustling city. There, he's kind of doing work. He's kind of finally trying to figure out what he's going to do with his life. And you get kind of a section where he's kind of debating about the merits of his romantic nature and things like that, until eventually he's put in a situation where he visits a friend who is a little bit higher up in society than he is, not really thinking about the fact that that friend is having a gathering of like more noble people and people above his station, and that really he is unwelcome there. And so as he stays, it's very awkward. He kind of comes to these realizations about like he's basically a joke to all these people, and so he bails. He like causes a scene and he bails. There is a girl that he's there with who he like flirts with and is friends with, and she kind of reciprocates, but then when it comes to she is above his station as well, and when it comes time to this like public gathering, she sort of spurns him as well, and so that drives him away from this city and back to Walheim. And so basically he goes back to Walheim. Charlotta and Albert are married, and basically Werther just becomes a weirdo who hangs around with them all the time. He's like a permanent third wheel. Charlotta likes him, right? She thinks he's a good guy, so she out of pity like and feels bad for him. And after thinking about it, decides it's probably best out of respect for her husband and for Werther in the long term to say like, hey, you cannot visit me all the time. You can't be here all the time, dude. You need to go out and live your own life. Right? And then he visits her one final time. He recites some poetry. They both get emotional. And then Werther basically comes to this conclusion that he concludes that ultimately one part of this triangle has to break, right? The situation has to resolve itself. And so that either means he has to kill Charlotta, which he's not going to do, or he has to kill Albert and basically like take his place, which he actually likes Albert. And that's one of the interesting things about this story is that usually you get in a love triangle and there's like beef between the guys, but he actually really respects and likes Albert. All right, so basically he's not going to hurt Albert because he respects him. And so there's only one way out of this, right? That means if he can't hurt Albert, he can't hurt Charlotta. There's only one leg left for him to hurt, and that is himself. And so basically, he borrows pistols from Albert, and he shoots himself. Doesn't immediately kill himself, but he does end up dying. Because he's killed himself, right? The funeral is not attended by a ton of people. No clergy or by Albert or Charlotta. If my memory serves me correctly, and I read this a while ago, they do end up burying him as like a sign of respect. They do finagle a way of getting him buried beneath this tree that he'd always hang out near in the town of Walheim, as he would watch like the peasants and their kids do stuff. And so, yeah, total bummer of a story. But this is actually kind of fascinating. Okay, so if we're going to get into it, this is kind of an example of what was referred to as Sturm und Drang movement in German literature. I'm probably not saying that quite correctly, but just bear with me, which literally means storm and drive, although usually gets translated as storm and stress, and was sort of a proto-romantic movement in German literature and music that occurred, in the late 1700s, and kind of in response to the rational kind of extremes of the Enlightenment, and kind of predating the Romantic movement. There's a lot of debate about what would actually fit into the Sturm und Drang genre. It wasn't like as widespread, or it's not as pervasive as some other movements that you'd hear about, but well known in German literature. Basically, with Goethe dropping this novel, turned him from relatively obscure into like a celebrity. People loved this book. They ate it up. And it was published initially in 1774 and then was revised in 1787. And we'll get into that a little bit, why there'd be revisions. And so, so Goethe just published this bad boy and he becomes a celebrity, right? Just like people are eating it up. There's this thing, Werther fever, spreading across Europe, which is, okay, so this is where we get into some of the legends and the myths surrounding this book. So at the time, Werther fever kind of inspired a lot of young men who felt moved or identified with the themes of the novel to start dressing like Werther, particularly with like this yellow coat that he's described as wearing often. But also there is the legend or the myth, which is debated, right? How accurate this actually is. That this book inspired copycat suicides from men who also felt unrequited love for different women. And so it was kind of seen as like scary, right? That this book could inspire such passions in the youth. Right? And then there's some more contemporary modern biographers who would argue that this is just, it's kind of been blown out of proportion and there's no real evidence that actually happened. But if you bring up this book, that is going to be part of its legacy. And actually, this is one of the things where Goethe himself has a really hard time kind of grappling with this novel. It's one of his earlier works. It's kind of what launched him into the spotlight. But it was also sort of him working through some of his own personal anguish, right? He was spurned by a woman, Charlotta Buff, and you can see, if you're a Goethe expert, which I am not, but in my research, it is pretty commonly accepted that there are parts in this novel that are thinly veiled autobiographical shots at her and her husband, and kind of Goethe working out some things. And so as he got older, not only did his sensibilities and sense of aesthetic change, and so he didn't really love being associated with this like overly romantic, overly passionate work of art, but also kind of I think the themes bothered him, and the fact that it is, by today's standards, no, but kind of an immature book if you're talking about an artist, right? And I think that really bothered him, and the fact that it was so famous and continued to be famous throughout his lifetime, even when people would come and visit him later in his life, when he had done these other huge works like the Faust play, that this is something they would bring up, that it really bothered him. But basically, Werther fever got to such a point that it was concerned authorities, and so both the novel and the clothing style were banned in Leipzig in 1775. And the novel also was banned in Denmark and Italy around the same time. Just out of fears that this Werther fever would kind of spread and, crazy. Now, my thoughts on the book, right? I was surprised by how engaging this story actually was. Like I blew through. It's short, but some of these older works can be kind of dense to get through. But I blew through this bad boy. And I've had this book on my radar for several years. So early on, in the first couple of classes I took in my undergrad in college, one of our professors had us read part one of Faust, and in kind of his introductory kind of spiel about it, mentioned Young Werther and Werther fever and this idea, right? And that always intrigued me. And so I've always thought about reading it, and for whatever reason, I kind of just like put it in the back of my mind as something I would get to eventually. And then recently I decided I wanted to start going through kind of my mental backlog of classics and reading some of those things. And I loved it, actually. I was surprised by how much I loved this novel. And I'll preface that by saying I don't think Werther's a good guy, right? Or even a decent guy. And I certainly don't recommend looking to this book for advice on how to deal with unrequited love. It's super problematic. In fact, that's what I loved so much about it, right? If a book could wear a fedora and claim to be a nice guy, this book would. As a former cringy nice guy, I spent a lot of my time in high school feeling unrequited love with huge, like, quotation marks. Or what I thought, right? And being kind of like bitter and overly dramatic and the whole spiel. And this book really holds up a mirror to that time in my life, and I'm sure in the lives of many others. It really forces me to see just how much of a doofus I was and how unfair it was to the people involved, and how it you stop seeing people as people and seeing them as an object in a weird, twisted way where you're not even acknowledging that that's what's happening. And so that's why I loved it. It really forced me to sit and think about just sort of my attitudes towards relationships, and thinking about myself in high school and how things have changed. And I go back and say sorry to a lot of girls that I probably gave a hard time, that sort of thing. And in many ways, I think that is sort of the point. Goethe wrote this around age 24, and like I said before, was kind of exercising some of his own demons about dealing with unrequited love and feeling bitter. And so I think that there are moments where you can see he's maybe a little conflicted with himself, and especially after the revision in 1787, where an older author, looking back on his earlier work, kind of made some changes. You can see where there are times where he's like full in on the no, like these passions, this is what it's about. And then there are times where you can see he's kind of struggling with that idea and what that means in reality, and maybe it is okay to like chill out a little bit. And so it's a very interesting novel in the way that it weaves those thinly veiled autobiographical sections and details throughout the narrative in a way that shows that, well, Goethe is building up Werther, he's also kind of acting as Werther and criticizing him at times in a very interesting way. Really, what it did for me is it helped me to kind of look back on some of the totally unfair and frankly, unacceptable attitudes and feelings I had as a teenager when it came to relationships, my suitability for them, what it meant, and kind of cringe at those ideas and the way I thought about things at the time. And that's why it was so much fun to read, right? Just having it thrown in your face, like, this is what you look like. I could see how this could be one of those books where if you read it early in life, you're going to get all the wrong things from it. But if you read it a little bit later in life with some perspective, it can be a really fun look at how silly being too ruled by your passions can be. And like I said, one of the funniest things to me is that Goethe became really frustrated by the notoriety of this book and how associated he became with like this super passionate writing style. A couple of quotes that I found really fascinating, and I just want to leave you with this. First, I am proud of my heart alone. It is the sole source of everything, all our strength, happiness, and misery. All the knowledge I possess, everyone else can acquire, but my heart is all my own. So again, kind of, like just really going with like the idea of the passions, like your heart, your feelings, and that's what makes you unique. Kind of following along in this vein, kind of showing you the cringiness. Sometimes I don't understand how another can love her, is allowed to love her, since I love her so completely myself, so intensely, so fully, grasp nothing, know nothing, have nothing but her. So again, like this idea of like he's in love with the idea of a person, and the idea of loving a person that much, but not really the realities of a situation. And then this last one I just thought was funny, a humorous observation that I found very astute. No one is willing to believe that adults too, like children, wander about this earth in a daze, and, like children, do not know where they come from or where they are going, act as rarely as they do according to genuine motives, and are as thoroughly governed as they are by biscuits and cake and the rod. I just love that idea of like, yeah, even no one is willing to believe that adults don't know what they're doing either. And they have all the same stupid reasons for doing what they do as children do. Anyway, fascinating book. I highly recommend. Like I said, it's definitely something it does age not super great and could be controversial or upsetting, but I think it has some fascinating things in it. Anyway, let me know what you think down below. I am super excited to hear what people think if anyone has read this, and I will catch you next time. Adios.